There's this moment from SpongeBob SquarePants that I've always found to be extraordinarily interesting. Bear with me. So it's from season 2, episode 15. Squidward is teaching all the residents of Bikini Bottom how to be in a marching band. You know, reading music and playing instruments and all that jazz. And it's going great. Until one of them has a question. So Patrick Star, SpongeBob's best friend, he puts his hand in the air. And then he very enthusiastically asks, "Is mayonnaise an instrument?" Well, is it? At the time, I had no idea, but I wanted to. So me, being the young, annoying little scientist that I was, I decided to investigate. So I grabbed a spoon and a jar of mayo from the fridge, and I started banging it out. Literally, I made at the time what I believed to be beautiful music, but was probably more of a cacophony. The point is, then, as a psychologist, then as a child, and now as a psychologist, I understood that that moment, that question, was always more than just a joke from a cartoon or an internet meme. No. That question is also the most profound example of creativity that I've ever seen. Now, you all know what creativity is, right? I mean, you might not be able to define it in words, but you have a general idea of what it means to be creative. Well, you're wrong. I hate to break it to you, but you're wrong. Now, don't worry, I'm wrong too. I've been collecting data about how people come up with ideas for almost a year now. And the more and more I look at, the more and more I realize just how wrong I am. Creativity is so much less than what we think. It's so much simpler, so much... I'm getting ahead of myself. I have moved away from the question, what is creativity? No. The far more interesting question, the far more potent question is actually, what isn't creativity? And the first thing creativity isn't is associative, at least in the traditional way. This is something called an associative semantic network. It was first proposed by Elizabeth Loftus and Alan Collins in the 70s, and it's basically a way of understanding how we store our ideas, and more importantly, how we retrieve our ideas, because information actually spreads along this web. Through their research, we are able to understand that, for example, if I were to say the word mayonnaise, you are instantly more able to think of the word egg, or white, or creamy, or jar, or mustard, or whatever you happen to associate with mayonnaise. For me, it's inedible gelatinous goo, but maybe that's just me. So when a normal person would come up with a new musical instrument, they might stay within this network. They might modify an existing instrument, like taking a tuba and making it smaller into a baritone, which, incidentally, is the instrument I happened to play in high school band class. Or you might combine aspects of instruments together, like an electric guitar, which is the instrument I could have played in high school band class. But when people think, they usually don't go beyond this network. But that's exactly what Patrick does. Is mayonnaise an instrument? Thoughts of mayonnaise don't trigger thoughts of music, and thoughts of music don't trigger thoughts of mayonnaise. But nevertheless, he still asks that question. And that question is itself a rebellion against this way of thinking, against this semantic network. It's a rejection of thoughts that we have, preconceived notions and traditional associations. That's why it's bold. That's why it's creative. But now there's a reason that such a simple question, just 4 little words, are able to be so creative, and that's because of number 2. Creativity isn't complicated. This very university demonstrates the exact same thing. We're known for our unique essay prompts, the ones we give to prospective students. Here's one, for example. What does Play-Doh have to do with Plato. Well, for starters, one of them is a children's toy, and the other is the most ancient philosopher that we know of. And it's the same thing as with Patrick's question. Plato, music, mayonnaise. Same connection, but it has one more commonality. That connection is simple. It doesn't ask you to reinvent a children's toy. It doesn't ask you to make a profound claim about the origins of philosophy. Patrick doesn't hand you a blueprint for an instrument. He doesn't tell you what it would look like or sound like or how it would be played. No, they just make that connection. Creativity doesn't need many moving parts in order to function well. It doesn't need complexity at all. Creativity's existence is predicated on its own existence. And that brings us to number 3. Creativity isn't practical. One of the most common ways that psychologists test for creativity is called the alternative uses task. Basically, we give people an everyday object, a pencil, a paperclip, a towel, whatever, and then we ask them to come up with as many ideas as they can for that object. Here is an anonymous person's answers for a brick. And yeah, you can see that some of these are practical. You know, using it as a weight or a weapon or whatever, but then you look at some of the more interesting ideas. Using a brick as a piece of modern art, a croquet ball, a teddy bear as a Barbie's coffin. Let me ask you this. How many of you have gone up to a 6-year-old child, handed them a brick, and told them that it was the coffin of their doll? I'm guessing not many. When people try and think of ideas, when they really dig down into it, they ignore practicality. They ignore whether or not it could or could not exist in the real world. And psychologists do too. When researchers like myself look at data like these, we don't code it for practicality or realism. We look at the originality, yes. We look at the number of ideas, yes, but we don't care about the practicality. That's because practicality and creativity have nothing to do with each other. Now we're on to number 4. Creativity isn't communal. You all know what brainstorming is, right? You know, a bunch of creative types huddled in a room with a whiteboard and an expo marker, and they're all scribbling out their ideas as fast as they can, shouting them out, interrupting each other. Well, that's great, but it's not creative. It's a different thing. It's brainstorming. A 1991 meta-analysis by Brian Mullen and Craig Johnson shows that as the number of people in a group goes up, the number of ideas goes down. And the people who have the best ideas, the people who have the most creative ideas, the ones that impress researchers the most, well, they actually worked alone. The researchers go as far to say that the long-lived popularity of brainstorming techniques is unequivocally and substantially misguided. Well, why then do we do it? Why do we work in groups? Well, the answer is very simple. It's fun. People really enjoy being collaborative and talking to other people. But you have to keep in mind that when other people are around you, your creative output is diminished. When you have an idea in your brain and you know that it's going to be judged, implicitly or explicitly, you're less likely to voice it. My favorite example of this is actually Tycho Brahe. He's this Danish astronomer who used stellar parallax without the aid of a telescope. Essentially, he looked into the heavens and measured the distances between stars in the sky and a 1572 supernova. And he correctly concluded that the stars and the heavens are actually further away from us than the moon. I know, it sounds obvious, but at the time this was revolutionary, that the universe could exist beyond our solar system. And famously, he came to this creative idea alone. He holed himself up inside of his castle Haven. He ignored the advice and research of other scientists, including his own favorite pupil, Johannes Kepler. His creativity sprung, in part, due to his isolation. Now, I want to make one thing clear. I am not trying to say that we should all be hermits. I'm not trying to say we should hole ourselves up inside castles or literally or figuratively live under a rock. That's not what I'm saying. I am advocating for a step back. If you're in a group, with your coworkers or teammates or whatever, you need to acknowledge the fact that their presence changes what you're going to say. Maybe that involves writing down on a piece of paper all that you have to offer. Really thinking about what ideas are yours and what ideas are others. Because creativity is a personal process, not a collective one. Finally, we're on to number 5. Creativity isn't abnormal. It's not this mythical concept only employed by artists and scientists and tortured geniuses. No, everyone has it. It's a process, not a product, and it's a process that we all have. In the words of Francis Pacapia, an artist known for switching styles constantly, our heads are round so our thoughts can change direction. We all have the ability to change the channel. It's just a matter of doing it. So, for all that creativity isn't, here's what it is. It's a connection between concept A and concept B. It's this thin, imaginary line drawn between two disparate ideas. That's it. It's unburdened by practicality and realism and what could or could not exist. It is unburdened by traditional associations and what other people think and complexity. It just is. Now, here's what this means. That means that the vast majority of creative ideas aren't going to cause paradigm shifts. They're not going to cause revolutions, and they're not going to invent new gadgets. No. The vast, vast majority of creative ideas that flit across your brain so quickly are going to be tossed aside. They are utterly and completely meaningless. But don't think for a second that doesn't mean they're not worthwhile. Don't think for a second that questions like Patrick shouldn't be asked, or questions like TEDxUChicago shouldn't be answered. Because creativity is not a painting hanging in a gallery. No, it's the artist standing in front of a blank canvas, paintbrush in hand, simultaneously imagining every single brushstroke she could possibly paint. Creativity is not the moment you're giving a presentation to your coworkers or to your teammates. It's the night before, when you're in the shower, shampooing your hair, and you just let what could or could not work, what people might or might not think, just wash away and let your ideas amalgamate at will. And creativity is an anthropomorphic pink starfish who not so jokingly asks an impossible question. And creativity is the child at home, watching and thinking of a possible answer. Thank you.